Planet GovX is a weekly roundup of the key public sector transformation stories from around the UK and further afield, as we shine a light on what's working and build bridges between different jurisdictions to improve delivery and transform outcomes. Planet GovX is supported by Forrester, helping government organisations perform at their best.
Hi and welcome to another episode of Planet GovX. I'm Tim Coulthard, and today I'm going to be taking a whistle-stop tour through the world of public sector transformation, central and local government stories. So joining me is David Wilde, our GM for government here at GovX Digital. We're going to take a run through the big stories that we've covered this week, giving a spin on what they mean, what their impact is and their wider significance. Loads to get through, so we're just going to jump straight in. Here we go. So first up, we've got the pithily named Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework. I suppose these things aren't supposed to sound fun, but I guess the point here is that it's setting the direction and the rules of the game for the future of digital IDs in the UK. So the government's released this alpha version of its guidelines, which the idea is it'll ultimately kickstart tech providers and the private sector to get involved in these kind of digital identity schemes, whatever they might be in the future, whatever uses and applications we're going to have, whether that's, producing your ID as you used to in a supermarket to buy a can of beer, or whether it's, financial transactions and getting your bank identity sorted and that sort of stuff. So, interesting uses, potentially lots of areas where this can impact on our lives. And the key elements of the draft guidelines are around ensuring products and services are accessible and inclusive. Obviously, the privacy and data question, data protection, fraud management, security. So sort of standard elements you'd expect around a data and identity project. But I guess, what does this mean right now? And where do we see this going in terms of, digital IDs? How will we identify ourselves in the future? How will the private sector chip in? What do you think?
I think it's laudable, the intent. The question I have is actually how much of it's already been done, and to what extent is government adding value in this, or is it another example of closing the door after the horse is bolted? The things I look at is I think open banking has kind of done that bit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we saw through the track and trace fiasco of last year that government trying to build their own is probably not the best idea. Ended up using a commercial, product anyway. And do we really have a problem with people proving their age identity and stuff? There's plenty of just standard methods. If you've got a credit card, that's a clue. If you've got a driving license, pretty hard thing to fake these days. So my question really is I'd like to know more about what this is going to do to support and enable what's already there. My worry is that we'll end up going through a great big intellectual exercise, reinventing what there is. So there's something, and this fixation with let's do alpha and beta around kind of stuff. Why don't we just have a sensible policy conversation? You remember the policy document thing we've done previously? Just have a sensible policy conversation and a baselining exercise about what already exists before we go charging off and talking to industries out there about what we think should be there, because you never know, it might already be.
So we got another unitary authority story. In fact, two unitary authorities, coming around in Northamptonshire, the Fine County. So we're replacing a whole bunch of borough and district councils with two unitaries. So we'll have North Northamptonshire Council and West Northamptonshire Council, replacing those smaller bodies. So I guess for me is it just two more unitary authorities, or what's the trend with unitary authorities right now? Is it only going to go one way? Are we going to end up with them everywhere? Or is there a point at which it doesn't work for certain places because you need that more granular regional identity and regional responsiveness? What are we going to do in the future? Is it just going to keep going this way?
Well, let's look at the UK. Let's broaden it out first. England is the anomaly in the UK around this. So Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales are unitary countries. You know, they have their local government structure. All three of them are unitary based. Yep. So they've done it. Okay. Now, all right, there's a difference between doing it in a geography of 54 million versus a geography of 8 or 2 or 1.5. So, however, what I find fascinating about the district, county, unitary arguments that you hear out there is, you know, it needs to be county because you need scale. It needs to be district because you need local. Yeah. And that's the real argument, because unitary is what unitary is. Yeah, it's a simpler, flatter method of doing local administration and delivering services locally. And so you have this, you know, local versus scale up debate that goes on. But I would question, you look around those other, the other countries, they've been through all this and they've come out the other side. It seems to work for them. The difference, of course, is they do have an administration at a population level of 8 million, 2 million. So there is a question, I guess, that comes out about combined authorities, and perhaps where I'm interested in this is the answer combined authority unitary? So that gets your scale for big infrastructure stuff, that gets you not to where devolved administrations are, but gives you those kind of bodies, still politically accountable bodies that can kind of put through those big infrastructure projects and deal with that larger scale stuff. And then you're back into the conversation. Then isn't about whether we go unitary. It's about what are the right size unitaries for the right kind of geographies and demographies. There is a wealth of research about this stuff. And if you ask people in the county council network, they'll take their piece of research. If you ask people in the district council network, they'll take their piece of research. People need to step back and go, actually, in the round, there is a lot of very wise sort of research around this that can help people decide that actually for this bit of North Yorkshire, you know, it should be 600,000 people and this large or whatever. This piece of Surrey might need to be, 400,000 people and tighter for whatever reason. And I've always viewed it as there's a kind of a three-legged stool thing going on in here, which is around economy, demography and geography. And it's looking at those three together and then forming a view. Government needs to, I think, set that tone and needs to drive that. As long as we say it's driven from the up, you're asking the turkeys to vote for Christmas, they're not going to do it. So you need to enable that. We're seeing some movement on it, of course, with North Yorkshire and Somerset, and I believe it's Durham, or Cumbria. Durham is already unitary. So we've got it going on with three kind of geographies at the moment. I don't think it's going to go away. I do think that there's, a little bit more courage from government in driving the agenda, and I think a little bit less debate about whether counties or districts should continue to exist, and the more grown-up conversation about actually unitarisation on balance does work, but you need to make sure you shape it in the best way to cover those three factors together.
So next we've got the thorny question of trusting government, whether that's local, central, in fact, any public sector organisation. We had a really interesting session on this at the conference in November when we were joined by people from the UK and Canada and North America. And, the conversation was almost inevitably framed around COVID and the government responses. And so I suppose the point here is, where are we now in terms of trusting government? Has the past year systematically undermined it? Have there been pockets where actually trust has been rebuilt with certain activities? And it leads to this point now where, the government has a vaccination rollout where it's desperately needs as many people as possible to be part of it in order for it to be effective. But, there are pockets of resistance, there's misinformation, there's however you interpret it. So it's a big question to try and tackle in a few minutes, but where are we now in terms of trusting government, and what are the next steps?
I think we're on a kind of bit of a knife edge on this at the moment. So I think there was a big dip in trust last year when COVID first kicked off, largely because of the kind of who in their right mind thought build a system in the centre and store the data and not telling you what you're going to do with it was going to work with our population. That's not how the UK works. We don't tolerate that stuff. But I think we've come out of that, and I think the real success story certainly around the vaccination program and the speed and the look around the world, just how well we've done around that, and the way in which it's been handled and managed, I think has been very, very good in rebuilding trust. Yeah, the reason I think we're on a kind of bit of a knife edge here is what government now does next on this is going to be key. Now, where I think we are at the minute, the beauty of what's happened with the vaccination program is it's clearly demonstrated why GDPR exists. And one of the core tenets of GDPR is you collect data and you use data. You're clear about the purpose for which you're going to use it. And for vaccinations, that's been absolutely clear. And the government and wider public sector, not just the government, this is local authorities, health and government, so all the public services have been collaborating, sharing data, getting real-time stuff. We get daily updates of how many people have had a jab. It's amazing, the quality and the richness of that data, all around a common purpose, to inform the entire population about what's going on and to help us all be better protected from this thing. And that's great. But what's going to happen next with that data? Is it going to be discarded when we're finished? Is it going to be put somewhere secure and looked after, and only used for the purposes for which it was collected? Yeah, which is for vaccination. Yeah, protection of the population. Or do people start using it for anything else? If they do the latter, that trust will go. It will go rapidly. It will fatally undermine it. So I think there's a challenge on the part to articulate to our population what's going to happen with that stuff. People start asking questions. When we hit 30 million people vaccinated, people will ask questions. So what are you doing with this stuff? What are you going to do next with it? Yeah. And I think when we come out of lockdown, it's in the road, how data is used to manage the consequence of coming out of lockdown will also put government and public services in sharp focus, because if the data they have is inappropriately used in any way, that trust will be undermined. So that's the knife edge we're on, I think, right now.
GDS is launching a new training course for senior civil servants to basically train them in the basics of digital transformation. Theory being quite a logical one, that even if you're not hands-on, but you're overseeing or responsible for within a department, a transformation program, you need to understand the basics of how this stuff works in order to be able to manage or oversee or get involved to some degree at policy level, whatever it might be. So the key outcomes would be around awareness of the government's digital priorities for the next 10 years. So a bit of horizon scanning, which is interesting. Awareness of the standards that digital teams have to monitor and adhere to, understanding how multidisciplinary teams build user-centered designs like that. Value of agile ways of working. We've had discussion about agile before, and the fetishization of agile methodology and lingo, and so interesting there. And then knowing where to access digital support after, and sort of build on their experience. So a couple of things that spring to mind here is clearly somebody's identified a need for this stuff, or you're frowning, maybe there is or isn't a need, but why they've done this now, will it help, or is it a bit like earlier, digital window dressing for something that you don't think needs to happen?
Yeah, so I'm just going to quote a couple of things, real life things that have happened in the last 12, 14 months. So we're going to train a bunch of senior leaders in the civil service to do this stuff, where they did it. They did it last year for COVID. The HMRC spun up all that fantastic stuff in a week and a half, around all the stuff around furlough and so on and so on and so on. So what are you going to teach them new? Yeah. And I go back into my own experience in the civil service way back 2000, 2002, 2003, foot and mouth disease, and how the civil service completely mobilized and tackled that issue. Yeah. The civil service is actually pretty good at this stuff. Cops a bit of a bad press. It is a very agile, organized, it's a very agile ecosystem. Whitehall departments chop and change all the time. Machinery of government is actually a really good thing. So let's not think that senior civil servants can't do it. They're actually very bright people and they are quite good at it. think so. And as for the agile piece, you know my view on. I've had my view on agile. Yeah, agile is a technology-driven methodology which is brilliant in its place, but actually, government is not a software product. Yeah, it's a different thing. And as I say, the civil service, our civil service, is probably one of the best in the world at managing that kind of stuff, and it's why it's emulated by so many others. So let's not kind of get that. I do think there is a need for senior civil servants to be educated about transformation with digital. I do agree with that. However, I question, is it GDS that are best suited? I'd actually ask HMRC to say, based on what you've done, can we have a look, please? Or HM Land Registry and the amazing stuff that they're already doing around that, or DVLA, and how they completely transform the way that vehicle licensing happened, or the banks. Because for me, I think some of the most fundamental and successful transformation we've seen end to end in institutions of a similar size to Whitehall departments are in the big banks. And you look at what the big banks have been through, all of the banking crisis plus digital and everything else that they've been through. Maybe we'd learn more from practical examples of where people have done stuff, on that regard. If GDS are going to facilitate that kind of learning, I'd be behind it all the way. I'd agree with that. My concern is it's in the abstract.
So it's census time. So UK listeners and viewers will know the census pretty well.
Why are we doing another census when all the data is there in the internet?
So let's unpack that bit. I mean, to me, a sort of once every 10 years collection of data in a world that's changing as rapidly as ours is right now might be regarded as anachronistic, but at the same time, I suppose having that level and consistency across every residence at the same point could be useful, beyond just everybody saying their religion is Jedi and that having to be regarded as a state religion and all these kind of silly things that happen.
Jedi,
So what's I guess the serious point here is it still relevant in this world? It's been run digitally, at least there's not like bits of paper dropping through letterboxes, so progress there. And and I'm sure the ONS have really done some great work in sort of optimizing it so that it can be more accessible, and that's a good thing. But I guess your wider question for starter for 10 is it relevant right now, and what could we do instead?
So my first question, and I'm in two minds about the census. I can see the value, as you quite rightly said, I can see the value in collecting a bunch of information from the population as a whole about a point in time to inform some things. And in the past week, it's been absolutely essential, because you couldn't do economic profiling or anything else without that data. It's so important for everything. But there is a question that how much of it already exists in the internet, how much already exists out there, and it's just a question of getting permission to use it. The reason I'm in two minds about it is back again to our earlier point about trust and the public, and things like GDPR and stuff. Because if we go around there just buying it off Tesco's and various other people and kind of mashing it all up, which technically I think is possible and would probably give us good data, but that's not really in the spirit of collecting data, and I think government doing that would be undermining that point of that principle around trust. Bizarrely, the census is a fantastic way of emulating that trust, because you're going to the population and saying, we want to collect a bunch of information to help us run the country and inform how we run the country well for the next 10 years. So can you give us this information? And in return, we as a government agency, the Office of National Statistics, will make damn sure it's protected and looked after and not sold on. And if done in that spirit, you can kind of go, right, I can get that, and that would make sense, as long as they don't sell it on. That's the question, which I'm sure they won't. So I would say, so there probably still is, on balance, and on the basis of that argument, I think there is some value in the census in helping to give that completely unbiased and uninfluenced view and perspective from the population into government about the state of the nation. And as you say, it is electronic, so it's less hassle for people to do, and I would assume a lot cheaper, if nothing else, in postage. So there is that. I do think within that, though, when they are asking for that information, don't ask for information that is readily available. Don't know the answer. Have they done that research? And it would be good for them to share that and perhaps give us a bit more depth of knowledge to the population that we're asking for this information for these reasons, and kind of, again, live that GDPR spirit about the census will be used for these purposes, and a little bit more detail about how censuses have been used in the past. I think people would find that really interesting. I would. I'd love to know.
That was exactly what I was thinking. Well, if you've got a 10-yearly, catch of data, what's it informing that? Let's say by year 8, what are you still placing trust in that you collected 8 years ago that you still think is relevant and is driving decision making, versus what actually is it's a snapshot at a certain point in time, and you have to work on the principle that its value or its accuracy declines year on year, and therefore you place less and less emphasis on it as a piece of data to feed into a decision making process.
And I was very privileged back in the late 90s to be part of the Neighbourhood Renewal Programme. I worked very closely with ONS, who are the organisation that do all this stuff. And they're really bright people, and they don't ask for data just because for the sake of it. They do really think through and do some fantastic, really smart research about what the data is that's needed for the government to help the government make better decisions. So what they do is actually, it's not boring, it's actually quite exciting, it's quite fascinating. And the intellectual input that goes into determining what a census needs to collect is awesome. And I think they should make people more aware of it, frankly, because I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, our audience are, local, central government executives, health executives. I wonder whether they know at what point they're making decisions using data that came from the census. Are they aware of it while they're doing it? It'd be interesting to find out. I'm going to ask them, in fact. Okay, and last but not least, budget week in the UK. The budget's a big thing, so there's a lot there, but I wondered if there are any aspects of it that jumped out to you where the impact on civil service and local government in terms of what they're going to be doing as a result of it is significant. Any highlights for you?
Yeah, I mean, there were 3 for me on this one. The first one was the Levelling Up Fund, which kind of really didn't get that much news coverage. It was all about, furlough, and it was all about, what we're going to provide short term, for businesses and stuff. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But I think, don't underestimate the importance, £4.8 billion of levelling up money. So what does this mean? This is money that is almost certainly going to be routed through local authorities and stuff like that. Would be sensible. The government trying to do it centrally, they'd be bonkers, but you never know. But £4.8 billion that goes in to improve where people live, to improve their lot in life, and very much, this is the government saying this was in our manifesto commitment, and here's the cash and how we're going to do it. And in part, of course, it's also replacing a lot of the European type stuff. Because all of those will be disappearing, and whilst there is going to be another fund for the European funding, levelling up is here. It's 4.5 billion. It's a lot more than 1.5 billion they're talking about on the European piece. That's a big ticket item that could do a huge amount of good. But in parallel with that, you've got kicking off a lot of arguments and rows about the Towns Fund and whether or not it's been distributed appropriately. So 4.8 billion being distributed, the key to this is going to be the transparency and the even-handedness with which this money reaches out and lands. So that, for me, I think it's going to be a massive issue over the next 12 months to 24 months as that amount of money hits local economies all over the country, driven through public administration. If it's not seen to be fair and equitable, there'll be hell on, as is already happening with the Towns Fund. If it's seen to be equitable and moves at pace, it will be an absolute key to the economic recovery, because for me, this is where you can reshape urban centres. It brings us our whole place is fit for the future stuff comes to life, spatial redesign, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's almost the following wind on the back of the remaining COVID-related short-term measures to keep our businesses alive. Yeah, which gets me on to the second big thing. So brave, actually. You know, the government has stuck with furlough, has stuck with all of those and put more money into keeping those jobs going and keeping those businesses going. And people sort of, oh, that's a lot of money. Why they do, you know, that's, and there was a fair bit of coverage saying, what, you're going to keep funding people having a holiday kind of stuff, with some of the cynical views that were coming out around furlough. But it took start of my career. So I started in 1984 in civil service, when unemployment was just knocking on the door of 4 million, long time ago, I forget, on a smaller population. And that was when, you know, we had massive industrial upheaval, as we know. You know, a lot of old industrial bases were collapsing and factories were closing, and our whole economy was moving to the service-based economy we know today. And people forget that unemployment is a blight and it's a massive drain on the treasury coffers. And unlike what we're having with, and I don't think this argument's been made clearly enough, politicians, not for me, but you know, you go back to the 80s, it took a decade for the country to get unemployment down to 2 million, to kind of, you know, still above where we are now. And that was a decade of paying benefits for huge numbers of people across the country, and massive deprivation and problems in parts of the UK. And the social implications of that and the community implications of that should not be underestimated. They were hard times. Now, you know, putting the money in now, and back then, of course, interest rates weren't 0.2 something percent. Back then, interest rates were 8%, 8 to 10. So when the government was having to borrow to pay for all this stuff, it cost big. You know, where now the government is able to borrow at much lower, and you can offset, as been said. You know, a lot of this kind of COVID debt you can basically pay back over 60 years at fixed interest rates on things like bonds. So I think they're playing smart. I think it's the right answer. If you can keep half to 2/3 of those jobs going, and companies coming out the other side, and people being stable and communities being stable, brilliant, right answer. Yeah, let's keep that through.
We've done the week in about 30 minutes, I reckon, so pretty good going, and we'll catch up again soon.